I had struggled with confidence growing up. I really did. I used to be bullied in elementary school. I used to be bullied a little bit in middle school, not as much in middle school. It got better over time. And by high school, I would say I, for the most part, wasn't really bullied. You know, people kind of left me alone. I played sports. You know, I earned respect in other ways. But, you know, I felt way more like I could get by in high school. But even then, I still really struggle with self-esteem. And there were certain things that I was confident in, and there were other things that I was terribly not confident in. And even going into college, some of that still carried over. You know, we don't just get over our problems as children. You know, we don't. The only way to deal with those things is to deal with them. You actually have to engage in what was the fundamental root of the insecurity that you might have had. And sometimes you got to go back to a specific event in your childhood, and you have to understand what the impact of that event was, the lack of context and awareness that you had as a child, and what your childhood mentality did to react to that thing that might have caused the ripple effect that now has you reacting by default to certain situations or triggers. And I think for me, you know, due to my meditations and my psychedelic experiences, I've kind of gone back and retreaded a lot of those things. And I've gained a deeper understanding and insight as to why some of those things caused me the trauma that it did, caused me to have the perspective that I did going into it, and has allowed me to heal from that now. Now, do I have it all figured out from childhood? Like, I don't know. I mean, I feel like I've dealt with kind of like all the big things, but you never know. There could be some shit that's suppressed that I'm not aware of that suddenly surfaces again. And I think it's always really interesting that there is so much that we are imprinted with as children that carries with us through our adulthood and forces us into cycles that we are completely unconscious of. You know, maybe you didn't get enough attention as a child, and so as an adult, you're constantly seeking validation from other people. But you might not even be aware that you're doing it. This is just something that is kind of an unconscious reaction based on that imprint as a child that forced you to, anytime you encounter a situation somewhat similar, your body goes back into this like memory of that moment of vulnerability and reacts in a similar way. And so that's why sometimes we have these triggers, these things that really give us anxiety or frustration, or we act out or whatever. And it's actually because of a childhood trauma where you were not equipped to deal with it. As a child, you are not equipped to deal with some of the things that you deal with. And that's where parents have to do their best to try to help you. But sometimes parents are the cause of it. You know, sometimes your parents' own reactions and lack of dealing with their childhood trauma ends up imprinting onto you because you will do something that triggers a reaction in them from their childhood that then has them react in a certain way, which then creates a trigger for you down the line, because then you're reacting in a certain way based off of their reaction. And so you can kind of endlessly go on that. And there are a number of cycles in your familial history that you will have to break. You know, you need to be the one to take control for yourself. And then you need to take that action and break the fucking cycle. Because if it stops with you, then your children won't necessarily fall for that. Your children won't fall into the same traps because you decided to address it before maybe even having children. And I would actually highly recommend trying to get yourself to a place of mental stability before having children. I think that would be important. Now, I am not a parent, so I can't give you any parental advice. But what I can tell you is, as a child that, had parents, there are certain things that you need to be able to overcome in your own life so that when you bring a kid into the world, that you don't immediately at least imprint some of your worst flaws on them. And you're inevitably going to do that in some ways. But if you become as aware as possible of those flaws, you can try to pass on the least amount of them. And then ideally, if you're a well-balanced human being, somebody who really has kind of that cognitive clarity, then you can imprint those best aspects of yourself onto your children. So, instead of giving them the worst and the best, you can give them mostly the best and only a little bit of the worst. You can only do so much. You're human. You're not perfect. But you can at least mitigate that. And having expectations with your children is important too, because there are certain expectations that you want the children to meet. There are other expectations that you probably don't want to put on your children because it's going to be unfair to them. And again, they're not going to be able to properly deal with it because they're not emotionally developed yet. Their brain isn't fully formed, and they're not going to know how to handle some of that stress. And I think just equipping your children, not to hide them from stuff, but to equip them with the necessary tools, emotional tools and cognitive tools to deal with these situations as they arise. So I feel personally like I'm in a place where I've dealt with a lot of those things stemming from bullying and being a nerd growing up, and also feeling like I wanted validation from women in order to feel some sort of sense of self-worth. And luckily, I'm not in that place anymore. I really am not. And it's beautiful because it took time to get there. I definitely had moments of just, loneliness and, being vulnerable, but not being willing to be vulnerable with people. It's really powerful when you get to a place where you're willing to be vulnerable with people. So I'm vulnerable with you all the time. When I put out this podcast, I'm sometimes more honest with you than I am with my friends. I feel like I'm pretty honest with my friends, though, at least my close friends, but meaning friends that I don't really talk to one-on-one like this. I'm giving you all a sneak preview of that. And, there's going to be a point where I might need to dial back some of this honesty and authenticity, for the sake of my privacy. But at the moment, I'm not a super big famous YouTuber or anything. So I'm willing to get vulnerable and real with you all.